morning, or evening, or night, depending on where you're located. I'm Janice Cumberbatch with the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the University of the West Indies Cayfield campus. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this session of the USAID Eastern and Caribbean Regional Climate Summit. Welcome back as well to those of you who attended this morning's opening session. This is the second of 8 webinars that the USAID Eastern and Southern Caribbean Mission is hosting between now and June 30th. The US government has demonstrated its renewed commitment to fighting climate change, rejoining the Paris Agreement in January of this year. Of course, here in the Caribbean, we know that climate action is urgent. We recognize the importance of strong partnerships for regional climate action, and therefore we've organized a symposium to join forces to share information and best practices, but also to identify challenges so that we can work together to find solutions. Over the next 3 weeks, we hope you'll join us because you'll have the opportunity to hear from a variety of people who are working to address the climate crisis. You'll be hearing from climate scientists, you'll be hearing from youth activists, policymakers, and of course, most importantly, we want to hear from you, our audience. And now to the business of this morning. As I said, I'm really excited because we have 3 excellent speakers, and I'm going to just introduce them one at a time, and they'll present in their own moments. Our first presenter is a good friend and colleague. He is Professor Michael Taylor. Professor Taylor is the Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the UWI-Mona, and he is a Caribbean climate scientist. I go further and say that he is a Caribbean climate advocate. Perhaps he's best known as co-director of the Caribbean Climate Studies Group at Mona in the Department of Physics, and we know that they've been doing some amazing work with modeling there. Back in 2017, Professor Taylor was appointed as a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to prepare a global science report on 1.5 degrees as a global warming goal. And that 1.5 to stay alive is something that we all know here in the Caribbean. Michael specializes in many areas: environmental physics, Caribbean climate variability, and he probably wouldn't want me to say this, but one of my best moments shared with Michael was when he was awarded as one of the 3 laureates of the Anthony Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence in Science and Technology back in 2019, indeed for this great work that he has been working with his team up in Mona on climate and the Caribbean. Michael, I'm really excited about your presentation this morning. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Really happy to have had this invitation to speak and really honored to speak. So let me get right into it because I know the time is, kind of limited. This morning, for this kind of context-setting presentation, all I really want to talk about is what I call some simple advice from Caribbean climate science. And really what I want to do is just share 3 simple things that Caribbean climate science is telling us, which I think we must pay attention to. So just to set the background, I want to point out that there's a very strong community of Caribbean climate scientists. We may not sometimes realize it, but there is a strong linked community of Caribbean climate scientists, and they're doing a couple of things. One, they're actively contributing to global climate science knowledge. So you heard about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in this current reporting cycle of the IPCC, which is the world kind of UN entity that looks on climate science and the latest knowledge, they are producing about 4 science reports, from the 1.5 looking on climate change and land, ocean, and then of course their major 6th assessment report. Amongst the Caribbean, there are at least 15 Caribbean scientists who are contributing to this. So you know that Caribbean climate scientists are making their mark on the world stage. Perhaps more importantly for us, however, this grouping of Caribbean climate scientists is really trying to create a picture of how climate change is playing out in the Caribbean region. And I use one thing as an example. Apart from the many papers they have published in journals, one of the things that this group of Caribbean climate scientists, or some of them, have done is last year they produced what was called the State of the Caribbean Climate. Really a formidable document, 11 chapters, 175 pages, 56 figures. You can see it, but spanning 31 authors across 3 Caribbean institutions. And this document really helps to put in as layman as possible a term, the state of our knowledge on climate science as it pertains to the Caribbean. What I want to do this morning is just say, okay, let me take that document, which is kind of a latest compilation of what we know about climate science and as it relates to the Caribbean, and say, if you took up this document, which is good bedtime reading with 175 pages, what would be the simple messages that the climate science community, of the community of climate scientists, is sending out? And here is what I think it would be. 3 simple messages. What's that first message? The first simple message would be this: wise up. What am I saying? So when you take the science that the Caribbean climate scientists are putting out, and I'm using the science from this document, you would get a message that simply says, wise up. Our climate is already changing and it is proving very challenging. So you would see that in phrases like this that come out of the executive summary. The very climate that has for decades underpinned the economies of many Caribbean territories is now proving to be their greatest area of vulnerability. Well, let me explore it just very quickly a little bit more. Why do I say that the message of climate science is firstly wise up? Well, within this document, you would find all the science to support that our climate is already changing. You would find the science to support that it's hotter. And I don't need to tell you that, we know this intuitively, but you would come across the science that our community has produced to back up that if you look on the hot days in the region, it has only been increasing since 1950. And generally across the region, we have 23 more hot days and hot nights since 1950. Where do those hot days and hot nights go? We know that the summer is hot. It means that summer seems to be starting earlier and summer seems to be starting long and extending longer. But you'd also find the science to support that our rain is becoming way more variable and the character of how rain falls is changing. So you'll find the science that says 1 year rain is very heavy and then the next year it is not. And you'd also find the science to support that, boy, what we are seeing is longer dry spells, and then when rain falls, it falls, really falls. You'd find the science to support that, yes, in the Caribbean, we are seeing more extremes. It's not a figment of your imagination. And that, over the last decade, we can at least account for 2 major region-wide multi-year droughts. And of course, you'd find the science that supports that higher sea levels are a phenomenon in our Caribbean region, where sea levels are rising at about 3.5 millimeters per year, double what it was when the first assessment in the long term. And that is straight across the region, such that all Caribbean islands can point to everybody can point in their country to an area which used to be on land, which they now know is in the. So what you will find is a compilation of science that says, listen, it's hotter, rain is more variable, more extremes, higher sea levels, or put together that the Caribbean is witnessing the emergence of a new climate era. And that climate era is marked by what we call unfamiliarity. We're not used to it being hotter. We're not used to the rain being so variable, the extent of the extremes and the higher sea levels. Why is this at all important? It's important because climate is a real integral part of our Caribbean existence. It's inescapable in our daily lives. It is in where we live. We are small islands or coastal dwelling people, or we live on steep hillsides in those small islands. And so irrespective of where we live, and we can't escape it, climate is there. It's in the life cycles that we pattern our own climate. When we plant, when we reap, when we send kids to school, when we clean drains. It's in the quality of life sectors. Our water is strongly linked to climate. And of course, it's in our productive sectors. It's agriculture, it's tourism, and you get that. So climate is an integral part of our existence. So what does this mean? Well, it means that as a Caribbean, we depend on the familiarity of climate for development and for real quality of life. And familiarity doesn't necessarily mean good. It just means that it should really just behave as we expect it to behave. And even when it goes outside of the bounds, even when it behaves bad, it doesn't go outside of the bounds we expect it to. However, if the science is telling us there's a new unfamiliarity, then what is happening is that that unfamiliarity, because of the sensitivity to climate, challenging our regional advancement and standards of living by simply rendering the pillars on which we depend for development and standard of living unreliable. And I only need to give you the news headlines from across the region over the last couple of months to make that point. So when the climate behaves in an unfamiliar way, as it is doing now, agriculture is impacted, livelihoods are impacted, roads are impacted, health is impacted, our biodiversity is impacted. You get the point. So the first piece of simple advice from Caribbean climate science is this: simply wise up. And so if you take this body of climate science, it's saying our climate is already changing and it's proving to be challenging. And why is that important? Because in an already changing climate that is proving to be challenging, our development pillars become unreliable. They cannot consistently give us development, nor can they consistently give us good quality of life. Very quickly, what's the second simple piece of advice? When you take the science that is being produced, the first is, of course, wise up. Our climate is already changing and it's proving challenging. The second one is this: heads up. Our climate is going to continue to change in ways that are more than worrying. And you see that, for example, in like page 54, chapter 5. Hope I'm convincing you to read this document. It is to be noted then that the projections suggest that as the century progresses, the Caribbean, under the worst scenarios, will be a significantly different place. That's some of the science that I do, and my group does. We project climate going to the end of the century. Well, what do we see? Well, the science says that even hotter times are ahead. And if you take the worst case scenario, anywhere up to 98% of the days annual will be hot by the 2090s, where hot is by current standards. That's summer year round. The science says, well, by the end of the century, we'll never lose that variability about rainfall. So we'll still get the ups and downs, but we'll vary about a lower mean. And across the region on a whole, as a mean, we'll probably be about 40% drier. And that drying will come when we expect to have rain. It's telling us that we'll have more intense extremes. I'd spoken to droughts before, but it's telling us that we will get more intense. Well, we'll get hurricanes that will be more intense. Not necessarily more hurricanes, but that when they pass through the region, they'll be more intense, higher rainfall rates, stronger winds. And it's telling us that in comparison to the 3.5 millimeters we've had already, we may have up to 1 meter of sea level rise by century's end. Put it together, the science that is being done in the Caribbean is saying, listen, if you compare to what we have already seen to what is likely to come under the worst case scenarios, we are heading towards a possible future entrenchment of a climate regime marked by changes outside the bounds of our present lived experience, or in other words, unprecedented climate. We have not lived through what is likely to come, or the future climate is going to look a whole lot different. Very quickly, why is this at all important? Why should we take the heads up science is suggesting? Because we have an idea of what unprecedented climate looks like. So 2017, we had 3 Category 5 hurricanes in the Caribbean, and we said that's unprecedented. But then in 2019, we had Dorian, which stalled, and we said, well, that's unprecedented. And then in 2020, we exhausted the alphabet in hurricane names, and we said, boy, that's unprecedented. So we have a glimpse of what unprecedented is. An unprecedented climate equals unprecedented impacts. See the images. Very quickly, even 1.5 that we argued for does not equal a safe climate for the Caribbean, and that's what the science we have been doing in the region is also showing. Because even 1.5 represents 40% less hydropower in Suriname, diminished agricultural productivity, 2 to 3 times increase in regional cost of damages, drier entire region, and inundation of our coastal infrastructure, including airports and seaports. Simply put, what we are looking on is that we'll be significantly impacted in all the areas that we expect to deliver quality of life and standard of living. Or another way to put it, the SDG targets we have signed on to. zero hunger, good health, quality education, clean water may be missed under climate change. And every SDG goal is threatened, except maybe for 13, which is climate action. So, second simple piece of advice, recognizing my time limitation. The first one is just this. If you take the climate science in the region, it's saying, wise up. Our climate is already changing and it's proving challenging. And in our present era, our development pillars are unreliable. They cannot deliver. Second piece of advice from the climate science community is, listen, heads up. Our climate will continue to change in ways that are more than worrying. And so our development goals that we set for ourselves are becoming unattainable if we continue in the pathway we are doing. So to end, what's the last piece of advice that's coming when we take the body of Caribbean climate science? It's this: wake up. We have to act now for a livable future. I think I heard that in the poem in the opening ceremony, very clear. But you can find it, for example, on page 2 of chapter 1. Given recent experiences and future projections, it seems clear that the Caribbean can no longer afford the cost of catastrophic consequences of climate change, nor can it afford not to respond to climate change. So the call is wake up. We have to act now. So let me end by saying, well, what can that action look like? Well, the science is telling us that one, the action has to be a strong mitigation agenda. Truth be saying, the science is saying there are still pathways to even 1.5. But if 1.5 is to be achieved or even delayed from occurring now, then CO2 in the next 10 years, then CO2 emissions have to fall by about 45% by 2030. And we have to reach net zero by the middle of the century. So it means that the science is telling us that in the Caribbean, energy, waste, oceans, forest, transportation, we must take a look on them, because those are the pathways for us for mitigation. They're also win-wins because, they bring benefits as well. But we have to address these issues. What other kinds of action? You're going to hear about it in the other talks. An unavoidable adaptation agenda. If we achieve 1.5, we are still going to have to adapt. And so we have to have an adaptation agenda that we define and go after from now. Some points about it: it has to be comprehensive and across a range of appropriate actions. It has to be in every sector, because that's where the sensitivity is. But it also has to be contextual and targeted to Caribbean challenges. That's the point of science. It has to be evidence-based, and the science is telling us research and data defined. So we need the research and we need the data collection to account for the extent of present and future challenges. And of course, it has to be consistent with the SDGs and recognize that actions towards climate will have synergies and trade-offs within the SDGs, but we have to adapt. And then lastly, of course, we have to have a sustained education agenda, because we need a Caribbean populace that's conscious, convinced, and convicted about the issues. That's the importance of a session like this. And to go with the sustainable education agenda, I think the signing ceremony this morning tells it all. We also have to have a deliberate collaboration agenda. Climate change's challenges dwarf the limited human, financial, and technical resources of any single Caribbean country. And we have enough proof that when a collective approach is taken, government, private sector, academia, civil society, youth, resilience is possible. So I end by saying, what's a simple advice from the Caribbean climate science community? It's this. One, wise up. Our climate is already changing and it's proving challenging. Our development pillars right now are unreliable and cannot deliver development or standard of living. But heads up, our climate will continue to change in ways that are more than worrying. And as the climate changes, our development goals will become more and more unattainable. But the last one is wake up. We have to act now for a livable future. We know the components of the action: mitigation, adaptation, education, and collaboration. And the beautiful thing about this is that we don't end on a sad note, but our development agendas that we are putting in place will become untouchable by climate if we do these 4 actions. What is the science telling us? We need to move from development pillars that are becoming unreliable to development agendas that are untouchable by climate. That's what the science is telling us. So the simple advice from Caribbean climate science: wise up, heads up, and wake up. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Taylor. A very powerful message. Wise up, Heads up, wake up. You can't get more plain than that. Straightforward and to the point. Thank you again. So we're going to transition now to our second scientist this morning, who assures me that there's absolutely no way to call his name wrong. I don't necessarily think that is true. Our second speaker is Dr. Cedric Van Merbeek. He is a climatologist with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. With a surname like that, of course, it's not surprising to learn that he was in a former life a climate researcher at the VU University in Amsterdam. But we're very, very happy that he has found ties to back way here in the St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we consider him now one of our own Caribbean researchers. Cedric's main responsibilities here in the Caribbean focus on building capacity. He works with regional Met services to provide climate information, and he also serves with the World Meteorology Organization in a similar context. I know Cedric mostly because he is a lecturer in climate science at the University of the West Indies. We're really happy that we have you with us this morning, sir. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Janice, and thank you so much, Professor Taylor, for the wonderful opening presentation to this session. I think you have our eyes wide open and our ears are listening, so thank you for setting the context here. So what I want to do here is to focus in a little bit more on the aspects of what is threatening us in terms of climate in the Caribbean, more specifically in the Eastern Caribbean, in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States region. So that's basically the Leeward and the Windward Islands of the Lesser Antilles. And we're going to look at projections and early warning, but also at ongoing trends and how all of these relate. So I'm talking to you as a climatologist with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. But more specifically, I want to talk in terms of our role as the World Meteorological Organization designated climate center for the Caribbean. Henceforth, I will denote that as the Caribbean RCC, so Regional Climate Center. What we do there is to provide the kind of capacity building for the Caribbean to develop, to deliver, and to uptake climate information for better decision making. So it's in that context that I want to relay some of our work here. And I know that Professor Taylor has introduced you into a good detail as to the unprecedented climate that we've had in recent years. Just to give another example, 2020 was one of the top 3 warmest years on record globally. And that was also shown in the Caribbean to be the case, whereby we could see that there was record-breaking heat in 2020, not only in terms of daytime temperatures, for instance, but also in the number of heat waves that we've seen. And so, again, that poses the question then, are we really facing climate risk? So here, by means of example, I want you to meet the Petersons. The Petersons have saved up a lot of money, fortunately, throughout their lives, and they have moved now to a community called the Valley. And in the Valley, they have used their finances to build a house. But unfortunately, the Petersons were not aware that the Valley is flood prone. And moreover, they are also not aware that our climate has been changing and the Valley is now experiencing more extreme rainfall than it used to in the past. And as a result, there is flooding that impacts them because they are unprepared for it, because their house was built to a standard that is not able to withstand flooding. Now I want you to meet a second family, and that's the Johnsons. And the Johnsons, they decided to build a house in the same community in the Valley, so still flood prone and still subject to a lot of rainfall. But the difference is that the Johnsons had access to information on long-term norms and trends. not only in climate, because the climate would tell them it rains a lot and there is flooding that ensues from that in a flood-prone area, but also on other things, like for instance, if they live in an area called the valley, appropriately so, that is where the water would collect. So they decided to adapt to that situation by building a house on stilts. And therefore, in most floods, they are fine, as opposed to the Petersons, which are experiencing trouble. But in our changing climate, you see that there are more frequent floods, but it's not just necessarily more frequent floods. It might also be flooding that is much more, that leads to much deeper water that floods us. And so we can adapt to a certain extent to flooding, but we can never adapt to all the risk to increase or to expand our coping range to flooding, for instance, or other hazards, to the extent that there is any risk anymore. So what is critical here? That is what we call early warning information. So imagine that it's been raining a lot for the past month, and you can see there's some level of flooding. But now there's a forecast that suggests that the next 7 days will be extremely wet, and therefore there's a likelihood of experiencing a 1 in 100-year flooding. And so what the Johnsons can do with this early warning information is make sure that they are safe ahead of that flood. Yes, it does not avoid all the damage that there can be, but at least they are safe. So I want you to see this presentation in context of climate risk and two different types of options to reduce the risk. One is adaptation through long-term information, and the other is preparedness and response through short-term information, which is early warning information. And in that context, I want to mention that the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, defines climate risk as the mathematical product of hazard, severity, and probability, meaning how bad is that hazard, is that flood going to be, and how often can I expect it to occur, times the vulnerability. The vulnerability means that if I'm impacted, I'm going to be affected, and times the exposure, which means I am in harm's way. Now, if I'm not in harm's way, then I'm not experiencing much risk. If I'm not vulnerable, if I'm not affected by it, I'm not experiencing much risk. Or if the hazard is not severe enough to threaten me, then I'm also not going to face too much risk. So that is how to read that equation. But here for this presentation, I want to introduce the word or the phrase hazard impact potential. It doesn't matter if you remember that phrase, that's not so important. Just think of it as such. Hazard impact potential is the frequency of an impactful hazard event. Or in other words, how often am I going to see something that affects me within a certain period of time? And if you look at the climate science, that is really, really good quality in the Caribbean, as mentioned by Professor Taylor. This science is very useful in terms of drawing a picture of how climate will be, but it does not really focus on the hazards related to climate extremes that ensue from this change in climate. And so, let's talk a little bit about what the Caribbean Regional Climate Center does. First, on providing long-term information for decision making. And that long-term approach is reported in the Climate Trends and Projections for the OECS report, which quantifies the seasonal patterns of hazard, which mean clear and now becoming unfamiliar, to use Professor Taylor's words, for hazards such as heat, flash floods, flooding, dry spells and drought, tropical cyclones, and sea level rise. Second, it provides the observed and projected trends in those climate-related hazards, because we know that the situation is already unfamiliar and it's going to become more than worrying if we don't act on time. And thirdly, it highlights a few of their impacts across the socioeconomic sectors that are vulnerable to those hazards. So, very quickly, what do we mean again by hazard impact potential? That is the frequency of an impactful hazard, or basically how often am I going to get a hazard that is going to affect me. So if we were to rank this between a marginal potential all the way up to an extremely high potential, let's look at how we fare with heat. If we look at heat, and this is similar to the pattern sketched by Professor Taylor, if we look at excessive heat in terms of how many hot days do we get in the hotter part of the year, you can look at what was observed, which is the thick black line here, and you can look at what is projected by climate models going into the end of the century. And you can see that both the observations as well as the projections show that there has been a strong increase in the frequency or in how often heat waves are affecting us, and that is not going to stop. It's actually going to get worse. But this might be a bit peculiar, a formulation to say that excessive heat is an unfamiliar hazard. Why am I saying that? It's not that we're not used to heat. No, on the contrary, some could say it's always hot in the Caribbean. But the problem is, if it's always hot to a certain extent, but that heat is never changing a lot, that means that our coping range is very narrow. We are not familiar with higher temperatures than that, just as much as we're not familiar with lower temperatures than that. And so if we start exceeding that coping range, that is when heat becomes a hazard. And it's a hazard in multiple sectors. For instance, if we talk about poultry and small livestock, they are very vulnerable to heat waves. And indeed, that is impacting our protein production for our nutrition. And so we already see impacts in livestock. We see impacts in child education, for instance, whereby if you were to compare a school that has good shading, that is properly ventilated, and therefore keeps the students quite cool, for instance, also through white walls and white roofs that reflect most of the sunlight and heat. And you compare that to a school that does not have those attributes, the temperatures inside the classrooms might be up to 5 or 10 degrees warmer in the second school than it is in the well-adapted school. So the well-adapted school would have students' learning ability to be increased by 10 to 20% compared to the school that is not adapted. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that important, that children would have the best possible chances at succeeding in life through a good education. And so the list goes on and on in terms of impacts throughout a diversity of sectors. So what can we say? What do we see in our trends? That since the 1990s, the heat impact potential is moderate to high now. So that means it happens about 50% of the time at this stage, and is projected to always remain high to extremely high as soon as the 2030s. Keep in mind, heat is the fastest increasing hazard. Another thing we can look at, for instance, here in terms of flash flood potential, is what is the seasonality of flash flood potential? And you can see the seasonality for the Leeward Islands, if you look January all the way to December, and then for the Windward Islands on the right, you can see that the seasonality is not exactly the same. But they do have something in common. Between August and November, that is when you get most of your floods. Now, what do the trends show? It looks like the impact potential is expected to change from the 2050s onwards, so not as early as the heat waves later on in the century. What do we expect? Up to perhaps 25% fewer flash flood producing extreme rainfall events, which is good. But on the other hand, those rainfall events that are extreme might be even more extreme, which means a 50% chance, a 50% more severe flash floods after the 2050s. And you can do the same for drought, for instance. And in this case, we can see that, again, by the end of the century, drought will become a much more worrisome hazard in the Caribbean. So that's about the long term. Now let's talk about the short term, about early warning information quickly. And so when we think about early warning, there are different timescales at play in which there's different information for different purposes. If you were to look at now and then you backtrack towards the left, so you have now, a few days from now, a few weeks from now, a season ahead, and decades to years ahead. If you look at the information that we've looked at so far is really looking at decades to years ahead in terms of long-term planning. What we want to look at in terms of early warning is those three other timescales, which is information for alerting and response. So early warning happens in terms of prediction and in terms of monitoring. In terms of monitoring, we know what our norms are, which is climatology, and we also look at what our long-term trends are. For the future, we also look at future climate projections. But how does it look like for early warning? Well, first with monitoring, we monitor slow and fast onset hazards. A slow one would be drought, which means it takes time to accumulate and become more and more impactful. A fast onset hazard is, for instance, a flood, which comes very quickly and impacts us immediately. And this monitoring needs to happen throughout the season. But we can also do some forecasting there. What do we do ahead of the season? We make seasonal forecasts. For instance, we're now into our wet season, and the Caribbean Climate Outlook Forum would have forecasted that the wettest part of the year will be particularly wet this year, which means that our flash flood potential will be very high from August to November. If we know that, what the Met Services are going to do then is to try to alert you as soon as they find out when there's a likelihood for a flood to occur. And that is something that we call subseasonal forecast. It can basically tell you, we see a likelihood for a flood event somewhere next week or the week after that. If that is the case, then we make sure that we're well prepared and we alert, we keep the people up to date in our weather forecast, because the flood is going to happen 2 days from now, it's going to strike in these areas, and it's going to affect this and us, such and such and such. So that is what we do in terms of early warning in the Caribbean. Now, I want to recognize specifically the American people for their 10 years of support in building our region's climate capacity. And it started 10 years ago with two projects, the RAC project in the OECS region and an HED managed project funded by the USAID on building capacity to manage water resources and climate risk in the Caribbean. So the RAC project and the HED project for short, they were making sure that we had this reference about our long-term and also start looking at our shorter-term climate information. But then this was discontinued with the BRCCC program, which built our capacity to provide tailored seasonal forecasts. This was also then succeeded by the USAID CCAP program that was led out of the 5 Cs that looked at improving our networks to monitor climate change. And finally, the SDC project that is now ongoing and that looks at providing subseasonal forecasts for the region. And so what we're doing is building towards seamless climate early warning across the region. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. You can contact us at that email address, and you can find all of our climate information on rcc.cimh.edu.bd. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cedric, and really appreciate the fact that you brought it down to earth. For those of us who have been paying attention, some of us may well be identifying with the Petersons or the Johnsons right now, and you know we're coming back to those Petersons and Johnsons when we get to the Q&A. Thanks again, Cedric. Great presentation. And now we get to our third presenter this morning, and I'm happy to say it's a social scientist, because we tend to sometimes forget that science is also social. And our third presenter is Dr. Mark Bino. He is an environmental and resource economist and currently the Assistant Executive Director at the Climate Change Center in Belize, 5 Cs as we fondly called it. Mark was recently the inaugural director of the Department of Energy in Guyana between 2018 and 2020. And formerly, he served as the director of the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Guyana. So he's a good academic colleague as well. Having served both as a senior economist and executive director for the Private Sector Commission, he transitioned over to FICs, and among his many roles while there was looking at the economic impacts of climate change and trying to find the most cost-effective adaptation solutions. So since Prof has already told us that we need to wise up, heads up, and wake up, and Cedric has warned us what can happen to the Johnsons and the Petersons, I think it is high time we hear from Mark about some of the responses that we can make. Mark, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Janice, and thanks again for providing me this opportunity to share some of the information that we have at the center, some of the work we've been doing, and as both Professor Taylor and Cedric indicated, kinds of actions maybe that are needed as we move forward. The presentation largely will look at the relevance of climate change in the Caribbean. It's based on scientific evidence. I wouldn't go much into that since the previous two presenters did a pretty good job. The socioeconomic context, because I think we all are aware that there's some underlying vulnerabilities that we have within the region. What we have seen is some of those impacts, and I want to drill down because quite often we speak to the first order impacts and we don't get to the second and third order impacts. And last but not least, what are some of the policy options available to us moving forward? As both Professor Taylor and Cedric indicated, the evidence is unequivocal. We are experiencing a much warmer climate. Since the 1950s, we've seen many changes impacting our economies, impacting sectors, and in some cases, we have not even recovered from one event when another event rolls in. So we're having multi-layered impacts as we go forward. Each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer on the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. And this is well documented. Therefore, as Professor Taylor indicated, it's not a if, it's a case that it is already happening. We have seen total sea level rise to about 20 cm since the 1850s, and these may seem negligible, but for economies like Guyana, Belize, Suriname, and even some of our island states that have a significant proportion of their population living on the coast or below sea level, this is quite perceptible, and it is indeed pretty troubling. Additionally, we've seen the various trajectories in terms of if we continue along the business as usual pathway, if we move towards really ambitious targets, the infusion of technologies, that we have different scenarios by which we can basically deal with the warming climate. In actual fact, therefore, is that the future really rests in our hands. And I think that's what our poet was saying this morning. It is time for us to cut some of the talk and start moving towards more action. And that action would require all hands on deck. Each of us not only wising up, but definitely putting our shoulders to the wheel. Now, when we speak of impacts, we have to be careful that we're not using a broad brush approach. We have possible impacts, probable impacts, very likely. And thus, in terms of helping our policymakers, it would also be important that we delineate what level of confidence we have in these impacts occurring, over what time period, because we all know that we're working with a limited and a very tight budget. And therefore, we do not often have the fiscal space to do everything, and they have to prioritize. Impacts must also be looked at beyond the first order level. And I'll look into some of those as we go forward. And impacts at this stage tend to be underestimated. Whatever you see as projected costings, do know that those are an underestimate, conservative estimate of what the real impacts are. when a hurricane, for example, hits for a category 4 or 5, more often than not, damage assessment is done at that point. Very few assessments are done 3 or 5 years later, and we just assume that persons' lives have somehow returned to normal, and that's not necessarily the case. And so those kinds of trends are not captured in a lot of the impact studies that are done. I show you 2 examples here of what happened in Guyana in 2005 due to extreme weather event, a 1 in a 100-year flood event. And this doesn't only demonstrate how it has an economic impact, but the social implications. People were literally living on the main road. They were out of their homes for nearly 3 weeks. What that translated into is that some of the men did what they thought was best at the time, and they turned to the spirits. What I mean by that is alcoholic consumption became even greater. This led to more spousal abuse. And so these kinds of social impacts are often not captured in a lot of the discussion points that we have. We hear about things like typhoid, we hear about the loss of crops, and the range of other physical and easy to document economic impacts. But those other social issues are often not addressed. Additionally, we see on the right-hand side of my presentation overtopping, which is an increasing threat, particularly from sea level rise. Now, Guyana is 6 feet below sea level, so we have to use these dikes to help to manage the ocean. Now, invariably, as sea levels begin to rise, a lot of the coastal plain is under severe threat. And so it is important that we continue to not only think about solutions, but also think about the way we're doing development planning. Other impacts included what we saw in Grenada, where over 200% of our GDP was wiped out in a single event. At the time, it was considered a category 3 hurricane. But again, even as we speak about the issue in Grenada, and we speak about the damage done in Dominica, I would like us to drill down even further. Because in the case of Grenada rather, a major spice island, not only was the crop impacted, but it takes roughly about 10 years for nutmegs to mature. That meant that by the time Grenada came back into the nutmeg market, she would have lost some market share. And so that's important to consider. In the case of Dominica, not only were the housing stocks impacted, but also a number of persons who had taken loans, because Dominica had a very thriving offshore university, medical university. And so persons had done up their homes, retrofitted, and the like. And therefore, they were catering for the inflow of students. When the Hurricane Maria hit, that university was actually transferred out of Dominica. So those persons were left now with occupancy. They had the accommodation rather, but not the occupancy. And so again, these are some of the impacts we are seeing that are often not immediately captured, that filters through our financial systems, and we also need to be catering for. But we at the center, through, as our ED mentioned this morning before the signing ceremony, have basically sought to examine the environment within which we can assist as our mandate dictates. And out of the Lilienthal Declaration, next slide please, we have crafted the regional framework, which is currently, well, it's not currently, it has been revised, but it's now awaiting assent through the CARICOM organs, and an implementation plan which is being revised. These have basically gone through a consultative process that we are able to understand what the needs are of our region and therefore take proactive action in seeking to deal with those. Now, what are some of the actions that we have taken? Much of what we have done has been at a demonstration scale, or what we may call pilots. What we're seeing here is the retrofitting of a building to basically withstand the categories 4 and 5 hurricanes. So we speak about adaptation measures. Some of those are already being done. We also heard about the assistance gleaned from the USAID and other development partners. This include, beneath on the left-hand side, you see the photo beneath that is a cruise station for collecting information with regards to warming, the temperature, how it will ultimately impact our coral reefs, the automatic hydrological station that Ambassador Lynch made mention to this morning in her presentation, and more recently, the acquisition of LiDAR technologies. We keep speaking about having evidence-based and being able to make evidence-based decision-making, having the requisite data and information to do so. This is all part of us building up the repertoire of data that our policymakers can make decisions from a position of information. And also, we heard about the issue surrounding nature-based solutions. On the EU project in Guyana, and you see this little picture here with the structure, that's where the sluice used to be, which is almost like 400 meters out already. So anybody who is saying that sea level rise is a figment of our imagination, we can already see the effects. And so what the government sought to do at the time was to pursue an active program of mangrove reforestation, which today we know as nature-based solution, in terms of treating with the issue of a natural area to reduce our vulnerability. Next slide, please. We like to indicate this because the youths are involved at a very early stage. And so to get them not just hearing about it, but let them actively engage is an important consideration. And so we can see two youths here being part of that program with the seedlings. Next slide, please. Some of our men going out to replant those seedlings. Again, getting everybody involved. Next slide, please. And most importantly, the women. Because when the mangroves came back, it also became an apiary. So they were able to rear bees in that community. And that became another livelihood strategy for some of these women. Next slide, please. We also pursued various options in terms of water security. As we are aware, 7 of the 42 most water scarce islands are in the Caribbean. And so we have been working with various governments as well as communities to build that capacity in terms of having greater water security, but using a renewable energy source. Next slide, please. As well as smart agriculture, treating with wastewater management. And so these are some of the examples I want to put forth, because what it indicates is that as a region, we have been advocating for action, but not only advocating, demonstrating what can be done through our engagements with the private sector, academia. We've been very involved with Michael's group in providing that facilitation role, as well as a number of others. And we want to continue to do that as we build the resilience of our region going forward. But we always continue to look for partnerships. Next slide, please. In concluding, therefore, as both Michael and Cedric indicated, we cannot adapt our way out of this crisis. Ambitious emissions reduction is an essential goal. And even though we would want to continue to demonstrate what is happening through various adaptation initiatives, the best adaptation is mitigation. The second issue is that we need to develop a risk ethic. In other words, we have to be thinking continuously, as Cedric showed. You may be building, but be building in a floodplain. Therefore, what risk are you exposing yourself to? We cannot keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. The Stockholm Environmental Institute demonstrated if we continued along a business as usual trajectory, by 2030, more than $30 to $40 billion worth of assets, infrastructure, and so forth will be lost in the region on an annualized basis, which is equivalent to 2.5% of our GDP. Beware of creating perverse incentives that may encourage maladaptation. And I like the point that Professor Taylor made, because it's indeed what we have to do has to be contextually relevant for our region. It has to be fit for purpose. It cannot be that we are importing just what others are doing that may not be suited to our peculiar situation. Hard and soft options to adaptation are two sides of the same coin. And so we need to have good planning, but we also need to ensure that we are looking at what the science is saying to us. And here I want to throw two potential issues. One, if we know we will be getting a warmer climate going forward, do we need to start re-examining, for example, our working hours? Is it time for us to do a study to demonstrate if we were to start earlier or start later, what will be the economic cost? What will be the issues involved? Secondly, is it time for us to start thinking, I've had this discussion before, and persons have said how expensive it is, but if we're continually going to be impacted by hurricanes, is it time for us to start thinking of having our electric cables beneath ground? We can't do it all in one sweep, but is it not necessary for us to start thinking about that? Because this technology is already happening elsewhere. This is where we can be able to demonstrate that we're not just talking about building back better, but we're actually moving towards building back better. Be transformative, innovative, and follow contextually relevant measures, and create a framework to translate scientific information in clear and actionable terms for our decision makers. Again, I want to close by just reading something for you. And here I'm saying basically that we need to widen and deepen our understanding of the impacts of climate change by establishing the root causes of the problems, not only climate change related causes, but associated problems, such as assets distribution and security concerns, plus the interplay of the various sets of forces. There are many conceptual gray areas as concerns proximate and ultimate causes, the contributory roles of poverty, and the linkages of conventional conflict and good governance. We must take a holistic approach if we are to treat with climate change. We must be able to speak not only to the climate challenges, but the sustainable development challenges that we confront as well. Uncertainty, therefore, is no excuse for inaction. Neither can we continue to postpone actions now. And so I encourage all of us to get on board. We thank the USAID, we thank our other partners, and we thank our community our Caribbean family for the actions and activities we've been able to pursue thus far. And we look forward to an even deepened relationship going forward. I thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mark, for your presentation. And thank you to all three of my presenters this morning. A lot of information has been shared. So I'm going to kick off the first question, and it's open season. Any one of you can address it because you've all touched on it in your presentations. Mark, your last statement about creating a framework to translate information into clear and actionable terms for decision makers. That struck a chord with me because I always feel as if we have a responsibility. I don't ever like to hear people say that there's a lack of political will or there's a lack of will. I always feel as if the responsibility is on our part as scientists, whether it's social scientists or biophysical scientists, to do just that, translating our information into clear and actionable terms. So the juggle is real. It's a struggle, okay? And governments have limited budgets. They have to make trade-offs. I'm tossing to all three of you. How are your agencies currently trying to assist the policymakers in a tangible way with setting those priorities? Indeed, is there a space right now in the region that allows you to do this in your respective organizations? Because we clearly have a lot of data. There is a lot of data, right? It's out there. The data is exponential. But how are we disseminating it? And understand that decision makers aren't just politicians. Decision makers exist at across the spectrum in terms of insurance and health and citizens. People make decisions too. So let's talk a little bit. Let's start our conversation this morning around, is there a space for that interface? Are you able to translate your data and information? And if you're doing so, give us some examples. Who wants to pick up on that?
Janice, if the others are okay with it, I can give a share. I can share what the CIMH does.
Please
so we one of our main roles, as I said, as a RCC, a regional climate center, as designated by the WMO, is to build the region capacity to deliver the information, but also to uptake the information. I spoke mostly to the delivery of the information and the capacity building towards it, but we also assist our governments, we also assist our socioeconomic sectors to uptake the information and to lead to better decision making, whether that is on the planning level, on the policy level. We assist in different ways. So let me start by planning, for instance. If you're talking about drought has become a major problem since 2009-2010 in the Caribbean. We've had 2 major region-wide droughts, and we've also had a very acute drought, but that was less impactful in 2019-2020 in the Eastern Caribbean. Why was it less impactful? Because that early warning information now is starting to be uptaken into the decision-making to avoid some of the worst impacts of drought. And so that is a good sign that what we're doing makes sense. What do we do with this drought early warning information? We try to help the governments to build drought management plans, in which, depending on which level of drought we expect and which level of impacts we expect, we will trigger a certain alert level that will then trigger actions in different parts of government to face the challenges that come with drought. So the planning is there. The policy stage comes side by side with that, because of course any plan needs to be backed by policy. So we try to assist our governments in having both those plans and the policies in place. The other major role that we play here is by building inter-sectoral partnerships. We call it our consortium of early warning information systems across climate timescales. Basically, it's a consortium of regional socioeconomic sector lead organizations, like, for instance, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, the Caribbean Agriculture and Research and Development Institute, and so forth, for 6 of our socioeconomic sectors that are sensitive to climate variability and climate change. So what we do there is co-design, co-develop, and co-deliver climate information in a language that is appropriate and tailored to the needs of the decision makers in those sectors. So no longer are we talking the climate is warming by 1 degree. What we're talking is, okay, because we see a drought coming, and because it's going to be a very warm season, but also sometimes interspersed with floods, that leads to a higher risk of dengue proliferation. And so that is information then that the medical sector can use to adapt their plans to suit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response, Cedric. Mark, do you want to add anything else to what he said?
Yes,
Please.
Janice, thanks much. If I just jump in quickly. Part of what we do, we're not so much in terms of the information dissemination, but in terms of adding the data dissemination, but we add value to the data to develop into tools. So, for example, the center has developed a range of tools, inclusive of one that we call Sea Coral, that we have rolled out in a number of countries, as well as the CDB. Now, what Sea Coral does is that it inculcates a risk management ethos within your projects. And this is not only for the public sector, it's also for the private sector, it's for civil society. So as Cedric was saying, you're planning to build or make a particular area a housing area. What are the risks you're exposing yourself to? What are the considerations? How could you then insulate yourself against some of these risk factors? Additionally, We have built weather generators. We have developed vulnerability assessment tools, which again, idea is not for the center to be doing it all, but through, similar to what CIMH described, a consortium of partners, we are able to roll those out. And we have done that with countries, we have done that with institutions, and we continue to advocate that if we're able to build the capacities, then we're likely to get much greater traction. Thanks, Janice.
Thanks for that as well, Mark. Just apologizing right now because we're trying to get our third speaker back. We seem to be having a little bit of a difficulty right now, but I'm sure we'll get Professor Taylor back as soon as we can. I see. There you are, Michael. We were missing you for a while. Happy to see that you're back with us. Do you have anything to share on that first question?
Well, I think the colleagues spoke to it. Partnerships are clear, especially partnerships with stakeholder entities. The only one other I would add is kind of, for example, with the document that I based my presentation on this morning. One of the things about, getting information out is people don't know where to look, to get at least a first goal for where to get climate information, especially related to the Caribbean region. So one of the things we have been really working on is putting out, for example, like the State of the Caribbean Climate Report, which is written in as best as possible layman's terms, which collaborates with all the, the regional entities and says, hey, here is a first stop. But if you go here, it will point you to several other places. So you don't need to spend the time Googling everywhere. Start here. We have similarly done this for Jamaica. We have done we are on the third State of the Jamaica report. They have asked that every 5 years it should be updated with the latest science. And then that data now, that report becomes the basis that they work with the government ministries, the multilateral partners, etc. It's the starting point for you to find the data. So the data becomes accessible.
I have a question from the audience, which I'm going to ask you very shortly, but I want to do a very quick follow-on on the State of the Caribbean report, Caribbean climate, because I did wonder if we could indicate where the document can be found, and if it's popularized in any way, do we extract any of particular points and blow them up on YouTube videos or anything? Because apart from, as I said earlier, the formalized decision makers, we're very conscious of our citizens and the citizen science and the fact that we want them to be able to access this. I'm just curious about whether it's popularized in any way.
Well, that one is so recent that it perhaps hasn't gone through that. But certainly for the State of the Jamaica climate, a lot over the last 10 years, where we, as I say, we're on our third one now, has been done to popularize it, to take out the messages, to create the simple things, to incorporate it in song. A lot has been done there. Hopefully we can do the same thing with the State of the Caribbean climate.
Okay, so let me bring some of the audience in, because that's why we have them here and we want to hear from them. So this is one to all the panelists, and it's from Keith Nichols. How effective do you feel our collective actions have been to date to informing transformational change at national levels? How effective do you feel our collective actions to date have been to informing transformational change at national levels, and what can we do better? That was like one of the questions that I would put on an exam for my students. So who wants the 30 points?
I will take a first shot at it. Since I know Keith well, he works with us. The truth be told, changing attitudes don't happen overnight. And with regards to the kinds of transformation that we need to see, they also require resources to do so. And we cannot get away from those two. However, we still believe that we have a long way to go. I don't think we have done as well as we could. And that's part of the reason why I said in my presentation, it's not only about a greater pocket of resources, but also in the way we plan, the way we govern. There's some actions and attitudes that we have to adopt as Caribbean states. And that is why I'm challenging us. Why is it, for example, we're starting work at 8 and finishing at 4:30 if we're having a hotter climate? Suriname, right next door, has shown us that we can do it. Suriname starts at 7 and she finishes at 3:30. Is there a possibility for us starting even earlier? Why is it we continue to build in the same old way that we have been doing? Is it because of a resource constraint, or are we dealing with just a short time horizon? So I do believe, I think what we need to continue to demonstrate and advocate for is that avoided costs are also very significant to be considered in this matrix. It is not only what you need to build back, but it's also when you build back what you can avoid going forward. And that also needs to be translated. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mark. We actually have a couple more questions from our audience. There is someone who's a bit concerned about the removal of mangroves in Guyana and the potential impact to the environment in the short and long term. The point that you made in your presentation, this is directly hitting at that. You want to make a response there, Mark?
I was hoping that somebody else would take it. I don't want to hug the floor.
Oh, well, that's entirely possible. Michael's face is not on the screen, but he's lurking somewhere in the background, and there is Cedric there as well.
But for sure.
And of course, the person mentions Guyana, but that's not only specific to Guyana. It's it's across the region, of course.
In large measure, and it comes back again to the point made earlier. We have to be very cognizant of not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. So in actual fact, we cannot, on the one hand, be advocating for something, and on the other hand, be undercutting ourselves. I do not have all the information on the removal of mangroves in Guyana. But what I can say is that the idea is largely to ensure that whatever actions are taken, the alternatives are looked at. So, for example, I'll be the first to say, as a social scientist, or as my former boss used to remind me, as a pseudoscientist, the fact of the matter is there is nothing like a pure solution, okay? There are always choices to be made. But generally speaking, what are the trade-offs and what are the replacements that are being put in place? So without having all the information, that would be my response to that question. Thank you.
And your response hits very much at another comment. It's not so much a question as much as a comment that has been made by one of our audience who says, y'all are all saying the right things, but how do we deal with politicians who run things? Here we go again, the politicians. Breaking the laws as we speak. There are 2 cruise ship terminals being built within a few miles of each other here in Belize. Everybody knows what's wrong, but they still have the green light. And I think, again, you sort of got at that a little bit, Mark, already in terms of the trade-offs and the difficult decisions that have to be made in the context of what has to be done. I want to draw a bit back on the integration of social and biophysical scientists, because the point was made about the long-term effects of what we're seeing. You have the immediate needs assessment, and then people forget. But then there's these long-term effects. How is that interdisciplinary approach being addressed by your agencies? Are you already engaging with the sociologists, the psychologists, to build that into the climate science as well, to build that into your projections? Because we need to address those social issues too. Are we beginning to have that biophysical social interface sufficiently? And if we're not, what would you like to see more?
Maybe I can.
Cedric looks as if he wants to answer that.
Yes. So the CIMH has a social scientist on its staff. And what we do in our social science program is multi-pronged in order to build a trust level with our stakeholders that the information that we provide is authoritative, that is tailored to suit, and that it can be trusted. So this is very important. If you're going to build awareness, if you're going to raise awareness and build the capacity of any stakeholder, or help them build the capacity to withstand certain hazards, to face certain challenges, etc., you need to demonstrate the value of the information you provide, the trustworthiness and that you are a long-term partner. And those are three social dimensions of transformational change that we have been working on from a social sciences context. There's still some work to be done. For instance, how do we actually demonstrate the value of climate information? This is called valuation of climate services. This is a very, very young scientific field, but it is critical because that is where you're going to be able to convince the politicians. Because once you can show that you save about 10 times more money by taking this approach that is evidence-based, based on the climate information that we produce, or that the sector produces, then it's worth investing, then it's worth convincing your voters that this is the way to go forward. So we are making strides, but there's still a lot of work left to be done.
Can I add?
And of course, please do.
Sure. Well, I was going to give you some concrete examples. I mean, well, certainly from where I sit, the Climate Studies Group, MONA, the Climate Studies Group, MONA, is not just a grouping of physical scientists at all. It includes quite a number of social science. It includes economists. It includes, the geographers. It includes people in the agriculture sector, the gender specialists. So there's a deliberate, we have long moved from the fact that climate change is really just a physical science thing. Clearly, we produce a lot of the physical science, but that's one clear way. A second way is that at a regional level, we coordinate the Caribbean Climate Modelers Group, and though it has a modelers terminology, that's been around for about 20 years now. And we just met, in fact, 2 weeks ago virtually. And what you have seen in the evolution of the group is the inclusion of social scientists, as well as the inclusion of young people, young scientists as well. And that's a very deliberate thing, because one of the things the group does is set what is the science agenda that we need to meet in the region to answer the questions of the region. And the science agenda is not just a physical science agenda. And then the last hat that I wear would be the University of the West Indies. We're very much integrated. For example, and I just use this, the Institute for Sustainable Development. And the Institute for Sustainable Development is not just a physical science, it looks at climate change within a whole sustainable development lens. But there's some very concrete things on the ground which pick up the realization that climate change goes way beyond just a physical science issue.
And I have a follow-on, because someone in the group has said, I believe the question is how are regional organizations, and you all represent regional organizations, supporting NGO advocacy on issues that we are responding to based on political priorities. So someone's pulling in the idea of, are you interfacing or supporting NGO advocacy and what they're trying to do in the context of, political priorities? Anybody want to tackle that one there?
Well, again, the center has worked with a number of NGO organizations. In fact, we work with youth organizations when we go to COP, and even before COP, for example, entities like Panos, Many Small Voices. There are a number of entities that we have worked with because we believe, as we have been saying, it's about policies, it's about people, it's about partnerships. And if we are able to get those three and really drive those home, the more that are aligned and trying to ensure that we're covering that space, we are still a fairly small center by any stretch of the imagination. So the more partnerships we can create to be able to advocate, and we found that the NGO's voice and the youth voices going into COP21, for example, in Paris, very, very helpful. It was very amplified, and it did allow us to really move that needle. And so we see partners in wherever they're able to help us get the message out, because this is not about CIMH or UWI or governments only. It's much broader than all of us. Thank you.
I have a question from Dr. Collignon specifically for Michael. Evidence-based decision-making requires incorporation of the climate knowledge and risk into public policies, legislation, and development choices. Can you speak to how we may engage with policymakers to speed up the incorporation in the public sector decision. You want me to read that again?
No, it's okay. That sounds like your exam question now.
Definitely.
But let me use our example of what we are doing. I would kind of say we're taking a four-pronged approach. One is clearly put the information out there first. Because if the information is out there, it's not just out there for me, the academic, it's out there for the entire public, including the policymakers, but including the stakeholders who fall within the realm of what the policymaker does. So our approach has been, let's put the information out there so nobody can claim that the information is not there. Then, after you put the information out there, broaden the discussion. So broaden it, of course, to include, for example, what we spoke about, the social scientists, but broaden it to include other stakeholders who that policymaker has to interface with. So if you let the education sector or the farming community or those who clearly have to deal with water be so convinced of climate change, then you begin to put the pressure on the policymaker, even though you have not engaged the policymaker directly. So our approach has been get the information, solid scientific information, then broaden the discussion to include all the people who are impacted and let them be convinced. All right? And then the third kind of approach that I would say is you then engage with, our approach has been the planning institutes of our countries. So yes, the policymakers can come up with a plan, but very often, like for in Jamaica, it has to go through the Planning Institute of Jamaica. And we engage directly with them. In fact, it is they who we convince, and they are the ones who know ask us to do the state of the Jamaica climate area. But once they become convinced, then when the policies have to pass through them, they become the persons who stop and say, wait, but so it's not only the pressure from the stakeholder side, but it's also the pressure from the technocrats on the ground who have to produce the policy. And then the last approach I would say is, and I think Mark was alluding to it, give them the tools, because they can then say, okay, but you have this, but I don't know how to access it, or I don't know how to use it. So create the tools so you take away the excuses. I think that kind of multi-pronged approach puts the pressure, and we begin to see it so that no major project can go to, say, for example, a multilateral, which does not say, wait, does not get stopped and say, wait, where is the climate consideration in this? So though I can't go and color the politician and say, you must, we can do, take this kind of multi-pronged approach and ensure that action happens.
Thanks for that, Michael. I think Keith is agreeing with you in the chat because he makes the point that it has to be a full multi-stakeholder approach and one that embraces everybody in terms of parliaments and everyone. So we're quickly approaching the point where we're going to have to wrap this session up, and I think we have had some engaging thoughts and comments from our audience. I'm going to give each one of you gentlemen an opportunity to make any final comments. I heard, at the beginning, Michael talking about the need to transition from unreliable development pillars to a more deliberate collaboration agenda and the like. So in your wrapping up, what's that key message? If there's one thing that you want to leave our audience of roughly 30 people with today, each one of you gets, 30 seconds, 1 minute to just leave that one message. Let's go in reverse order of how we had presented at the beginning. Mark, you go first.
Okay, thanks, Janice. What I would like to leave the audience with is that all our development strategies must incorporate the climate change related issues, with people, for example, being at the core of that strategy. Because the evidence is quite clear, we have to take action, and we have to take action now. Rather, it illustrates the adage that there is nothing like a free lunch. However, let us ensure that we do not freeze out the most vulnerable in a time of warming of our planet. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Cedric, you're again in the middle.
No problem. What I would say in conclusion is that if we really want to do better in future, let's start by building our capacity to tackle the problems right now. And then by knowing how to tackle the problems as they are right now, we build the systems that are suited to provide solutions for tackling the problems in future. So that is where the early warning component actually builds the adaptation agenda, because you start building those partnerships that can tackle the problem. You start having the evidence base that can tackle the problem, and you start thinking of solutions, though they might be geared slightly differently because of a changing climate. You start having those solutions in place. And so tackling the problem by using the early warning information in planning, whether that is seasonal planning or longer term planning, that can help set the stage to really bring transformation for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Cedric. Michael? Final words?
Beyond just saying, listen, listen, wise up, heads up, and wake up. But I would say, listen, my last message would be we have enough to do something now. We have information, we have enough. It may not be complete, but we have enough information. We have enough capacity and expertise, as you have seen just from this session within the region. It may not be all concentrated in one place, and that's why collaboration is important. And we have enough examples where we can point to. I think Marcus pointing to a number of them, where we know when you take the intervention, it changes people's lives. So we have enough to do something now. Let us just scale this up and go about it as in a wholesale as a region, and involve the youth, because they are the ones with the enthusiasm and the energy.
Excellent points on which to end this fabulous session. I want to thank all three of you gentlemen. Time is a really fleeting resource, and you gave us plenty of it this morning. I want to thank all of the attendees for being here. And I want to remind you that this is only the second in 8 sessions. The next session will be happening next Wednesday, June 23rd. So please come back and join us to hear more about social and health and economic impacts of climate change. And we've already put the link in the chat for you, so make a note of it so you can join us. We want to thank you ever so much on behalf of the USAID. I want to also acknowledge Environmental Incentives, the group of magical creatures working in the background who made this flow so seamlessly. Everyone, remember, wise up, heads up, wake up, and be safe. Have a fabulous rest of your day. All the best. Good morning. Good afternoon.